and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG Podcast. I am Clayton.
I'm Eliot.
I'm Jordan.
Before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help us out with supporting the show, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia. So if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. And thank you for joining us today for an episode that is being recorded in person for the first time in like 3 years.
Yay.
Yay! Because of the holidays, we were all able to get together, so we seized upon the opportunity to actually sit in the same room with you guys for the first time forever.
Many moons.
More than half the life of this podcast. So,
Wow.
Only my second time. Way back in the day, I dropped in on one, and that was years ago.
So thank you, Eliot and Jordan, for joining me today, and thank you, everybody. Today we're going to be actually kind of revisiting an episode that we did before. Back at episode 26, we talked about a magocracy, how that would look in an actual fantasy world and the effects that would have. We're going to kind of revisit that, but we're going to take the discussion in some different ways to talk about some things that we didn't actually get to last time we talked about it. We're going to be focused more on in what ways magic is actually going to have a direct impact on society, the different ways that the different spells in the player's handbook might actually change day-to-day life, and how that would affect the actual structure of society. Last time we talked a lot about how this would create a ruling elite who would basically run the entire show. But we really didn't go into the mechanisms by which that ruling elite would perpetuate itself, whether or not there would be mechanisms for people who were not part of the elite to join the elite, and the possibility of the democratization of the power that magic seems to hold. So we're going to be talking about specifically the different types of magic that exists in divine magic, arcane magic, but we're also going to be talking about the ways that particular magic diffuses amongst the population, whether it is something that is learned, it is something that is innate, or it is something that is bestowed by something greater than the people themselves. Eliot, this was a topic that you had suggested that we had been thinking lately about this particular area. Is there what made you want to talk about this?
Well, so I'm a serial world builder. I'm a very infrequent game player and runner, I guess, compared to the amount of time that I obsess about worlds and world building. It's just a separate hobby all its own I've had my whole life. And it couples up with history. I have a big love of history. And, lately I've been very interested in prehistory and long time span cultural changes. And, when you look at Dungeons and Dragons, you imagine at least I do, I imagine a King Arthur style world where magic is real, but there's a king, a kingdom, feudal kind of basics, framework in most games. And then there's like a wizard who's the bad guy, or there's the apprentice in your party. And just thinking about the world, a real world, a more realistic path. When you really look at D&D specifically, in 5th edition, obviously the game rules trump, suspension of disbelief, I guess. So, in 5th edition, they brought in cantrips. I guess it started in kind of a 4th edition concept they kept. And you could, in just looking at it, my thoughts are just the existence of a cantrip almost breaks society in a lot of ways. And just looking at it, I pulled up on my phone randomly. My first thought was like acid splash, a very fairly mundane, not even really very used cantrip in most cases. But just thinking about it, imagine just industrially, if a wizard could provide a kingdom or a court just essentially infinite acids that could be applied in so many different ways that you could quickly see a political entity becoming essentially addicted or, dependent upon the magic industry, and would quickly, in my mind, that's when I pose this to you guys, I have a hard time envisioning a path where society doesn't just evolve into magocracy. And so, my thoughts are, what would it be like? How could that not happen? So the obvious answer is it would just be a magocracy, and I just kind of wanted to kick around with you guys maybe ways that could be avoided, or how could that be tempered.
I think if you're looking at the different rules systems that have existed in D&D, only in 4th and 5th editions could you get to the point where did it exist that cantrips were an unlimited resource for spellcasters. In 3rd edition, cantrips were a class of spells that you had more often access to than first level spells, but you still had a limited number of times per day you could cast them. And before that, cantrip was its own spell, and it was a first level spell, and it lasted for a while, and you could do different magical things during the course of that duration. So it was still limited in the same way that other magic was limited. But 4th edition and 5th edition, where cantrips are something you can cast every 6 seconds, I think it really changes the dynamic of the worlds in which these types of spells take place, or in which these spells are used. And in a lot of ways, most of the settings don't reflect that change in magic. They're still, if you read the text of the campaign settings, of the established D&D campaign settings, you're seeing that it still assumes that magic works the same way it did in 1st and 2nd and 3rd edition, rather than the way it works in current edition. And I think that that's a reworking of a lot of settings that probably should happen. Eberron is a setting that came out in 3.5, and I would use that as my metric for the lore of that world, as the metric for how a society in which certain people had unlimited access to very low level magic, because that's the entire basis of that setting. I think that all the other settings should kind of have an update that kind of brings them a little bit closer to what Eberron does, if we're assuming that the world is one in which magic works by the D 5th edition rules. And because of the different edition changes, particularly the way that Forgotten Realms has dealt with edition changes over the years, they've actually implemented that into the lore. They've had different cataclysms that have happened that reflect the transition to a new edition. And I think that would be an opportunity, and particularly in Forgotten Realms, to have this revolution in magic happen that makes narrative sense, and you can explore the new development of magic in this new way, and how that would affect an existing society.
The cantrip had its origin in 1st edition Unearthed Arcana. That's where it shows up. And it's got a whole list of particular cantrips, and it's basically like little mundane chores, like drying something or like cleaning something, changing the color or whatever. And you could do it a number of days or a number of times per day equal to your level, and it was just a quick little trick. And yeah, Clayton's right. In 2nd edition, it becomes a first level spell. You get a few cantrips for that spell slot. 3rd edition, there's this whole class of 0 level spells. And then, 4th and 5th edition, you wind up with this unlimited source of magical power. And it breaks down for the same reasons that you're talking about, all the traditional worlds. And I think that's why 5e doesn't bother to get into much in the way of the economics, for the reasons that you're talking about. Even Eberron, kind of hints at it, that it's influenced by it, but is it really, though?
I definitely didn't want, the cantrip concept is I think the best example of where my thoughts were at. But really, I mean, you can take the cantrip thing off the table. I get why they did it, and I love the cantrip concept for the player, but that's just the best example. But even if you had limited magic, I still think that a D&D high fantasy kind of magic system embedded in a world inspired by feudal fantasy, feudal history, I guess you could say. I think that to make that realistic, you really have to put some thought into why doesn't just a wizard rule all this? Because if you're able to even throw Fireball a couple times a day, that alone should be enough for you to parlay with your high intelligence the ability to, like what's the bad guy in Conan?
Thulsa Doom.
Yeah, do a Thulsa Doom kind of thing, where just the ability to do fairly low-level D&D magic with limitations should still allow that wizard to parlay their way into power if they want to.
Well, I mean, then you get into, kind of the game theory calculations of like, okay, if magic exists, how prevalent is it? If it is well known and a good number of people can do it, then for every person that is trying to exploit it, there's also people selling countermeasures of some kind, and you just kind of have this like feedback loop thing going on.
Yeah.
But if you're just talking about like the kind of ephemeral point and click magic that you get a lot of in 5th edition, I can see that leading to a lot of political power, but I don't think it leads to the like magical industrial revolution that you were talking about at the beginning. Like permanency doesn't exist anymore. In old stuff, in old editions, there was a limited number of things that you could make permanent. And that I could see, if you have a permanent campfire, a permanent source of heat, the rest of industrialized civilization follows not long after. You have unlimited energy, off you go. To the stars.
See, and that's why my mind, like, I've really grappled with this as a world builder now, like probably for a decade. It's been a front and center thought whenever I world build, because your example of Eberron's great in that they kind of embrace the idea of, well, let's, if there is high magic, let's create a grand civilization, because it would be. From what I would like to do in my world building is I want it to be Merlin, not King Merlin. And I don't want the wizards to rule the place, but I also want there to be logical embedded in the world, say taboos or cultures, or like you were saying, just rarities. Perhaps it's just so rare. The ability to cast magic if it's just impossibly rare, then just by numbers, you probably wouldn't have lots of power. But I want it to make sense. I want the feudal world, but I also want it to make sense why there's also this fairly, intricate, powerful magic system.
I think that there's a huge disconnect between what is presented as the lore for a world and what is presented as the rules for the game. And you're talking about trying to have the lore remain as it is, and yet we still have this abundance of magic where pretty much every single class, either from level 1 or at some point later on, gains access to some sort of magical trait. I have a very difficult time seeing it where even if the percentage of the population who had any levels whatsoever as being relatively low, like 1% of the entire population has a level of some player character class. I have a hard time seeing that as that being reflected in maintaining the quasi-Western medieval world that exists in the setting without it running off of the rails the moment one of the big movers and shakers who is a relatively high-level character wants to make things different. You would literally have to have agents who are constantly fighting to maintain the status quo, and that is usually within the purview of the adventurers themselves. The adventurers are themselves agents of the status quo. They're trying to prevent the evil wizard from doing whatever. They're trying to prevent this big cataclysm from happening. They're trying to maintain the status quo.
That's a good way of looking at it. I never thought about it like that. That's an interesting idea. That a fun game would turn that on its head, but I won't go down that alley. But yeah, for that very reason, that's why to me, like that sounds fun as a world. That's a tall order as a world builder. So maybe you have it in your long term that you have the pendulum swinging back and forth. That over enough time, it's inevitable that any social construct to limit a magic user is eventually going to be overcome by just the sheer power of a powerful individual. But then explaining how the pendulum maybe draws back, and that's that cataclysm that's so common in fantasy settings that they're. But then we haven't even talked about something you'd mentioned that's just as important is divine magic. And because not only do you have to grapple in a D&D fantasy world with magic, how does that work? How does this world exist but there's magic in it? But the gods are real and they are multitudinous and they care enough to give individuals lots of power for their own selves. So what's that about? If a god is literally feeding magic down to individuals on the plane, how do they not run everything? How's not everything a theocracy? A magical theocracy, you know?
Well, the cosmology of D&D lays out this, kind of ring-shaped pantheon that reflects the outer planes. Each of these kind of map to points on the two-dimensional alignment, of course, and they're all kind of in that tug of war that results in a more or less net balance that is the status quo. So that's kind of the answer as to why no particular god
one can't really get over on the other.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like a 9-way tug of war or something. But what that doesn't explain is how the arcane casters fit into that, because to my mind it seems like every single god pretty much has a pretty good reason to stamp out human originated magic at every turn. So I think that there really should be way more wizard burnings in D&D settings than you ever see, and that happens a little bit in a few places. Like Kryn has that some, and Greyhawk has that. I'm not so sure about Forgotten Realms. I'm just ignorant of the realms, but there's an entire country in Greyhawk called the Pale, the Theocracy of the Pale, and this god Fultus, who's like it's like if you take Palor and then put this like skin on him that is like the crusade and the Inquisition, this god of light and like stomping out evil. They run that whole place, and they absolutely will burn not just wizards but non-aligned clerics just whenever they feel like it. So yeah, I think you'd see a lot of that kind of stuff.
Modern D&D's also, it's going to be difficult. Like future editions, I'm interested in the Dragonlance. They're in the process of reviving and republishing Dragonlance for consumption in 5th. And because I'd forgotten that. You were totally right. I'd forgotten that there was hostility towards certain classes, basically almost like racism, like the witch burnings back in the day. It's going to be difficult for modern publishers to make that make sense. I think we're independent world builders. People who like to build their own worlds are going to have less inspiration in the published Wizards of the Coast stuff to have those kinds of logical conclusions that there might, just because that feels bad, and they're not going to want to publish. You know what I mean? They're not going to want to encourage you to have, maybe, all wizards are burned at the stake.
They don't want any player to be singled out regardless of what they're doing. You can walk around as a half-demon sorcerer through the streets of,
with a good
Catholic
alignment.
city, and nobody's going to bat an eye. So, yeah, Wizards has completely jumped the shark as far as any kind of believable settings ever again, I think. At least for this era.
I don't know about that. I do think that they're just not updating their paradigm of how a setting is created. They're still just throwing everything in everything in the kitchen sink is going into the setting, and there's no thought into how that would affect them. I think that if we were to do this and try to think through, like going back to my example of how the Forgotten Realms, each edition, they've kind of, except for 5th edition, each edition they had some sort of cataclysm that reflected the change in magic and why the rules are now different for how magic works. It was always half measures for explaining why the wizards are suddenly, or why sorcerers suddenly exist in the world. They didn't exist before. And I think that not thinking through the sudden emergence of tieflings and how that would affect all of these societies that in older D&D, there were good races, there were evil races, and the evil races are persecuted in good aligned places, and the good aligned races are persecuted in evil aligned places. There's just not the follow through of, well, what would that actually look like? And you don't even have to have it be an adventure in and of itself, which is what I personally would do. I would make an adventure in and of itself, a campaign in and of itself of how this change reflects in the world. I like particularly the jump between 3rd edition and 4th edition, because Magic system was so vastly different. There wasn't that thought put into the lore, because there was another big time jump in Forgotten Realms when that edition change happened. There wasn't the thought into how would this affect society on a macro scale and a micro scale.
I think it's a tall order to ask a publishing company to come up with a completely concise, everything works right, magic seamlessly flowing into with other epic heroes. And then on top of that, an adjacent topic that I just want to touch on that relates is that I'm also coming at this from a perspective of, I'm assuming that, you also have to reckon with how long what's the evolutionary process of this fantasy world, since the gods are real and they have their own unique mythologies. Did they evolve? Is there evolution? Because if was there a Stone Age? Because looking at Tolkien, for example, there really wasn't. I mean, there was. I mean, I guess in the current series, in the Harfoots, they're trying to show a proto-Hobbit or whatever, but more or less, humans and elves woke up in their own respective times. They kicked rocks for a little bit until the gods found, and then, took them somewhere and showed them how to do everything. And then the elves, in a couple thousand years, they just brought that all back to Middle Earth and then taught the humans, who are still kicking rocks, and they learned everything they know, But in a contrary thought, it's like, well, if human society evolves over a long period of time and magic is real, how did that spring up? Would there have been? I feel like there would have been. There's a lot of interesting content to generate if you assume that magic is going to be constrained and have this long evolutionary almost time span to evolve. There would have to be these very interesting cultures that are reflected in your world that will look very different from ours, because they're grappling with the fact that magic is real and that's not always good. And sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. How do you harness magic in times of need without it casting everyone into a pharaoh-style slavery, I guess, in ancient Egypt or something like that? So, I mean, I'm not saying it from the perspective of oh, look at these dummies, they didn't think of this. It's well, it's hard, and that could be the inspiration for a world, and that would be interesting. So I almost want to just ask, what do you guys think in a King Arthur style magic world where it's like the D&D rule book, what are some limiting factors that a world builder could put on magic they could keep the book legal, but just on the cultural superstructure serve to limit it? I came up with this thing called the Lannis Ordo in my world, where it's just that the society eventually overthrows their magic overlords, and they greatly restrict the social aspect of a magic user's lives down to mandatory, they would limit the availability of written spells. They would, vows of chastity, very much like the Catholic Church, modeled after that, top-down regulatory structure, where eventually if someone goes rogue, they snuff them out. And that's maintained through culture rather than necessarily someone at the top leading it. You know what I mean? That was my solution.
Yeah. So you said a lot of things there that I want to respond to. To start with, no, I don't think it's too much to ask Wizards of the Coast to have a coherent world that they're running in. TSR
You're not the target audience anymore, Jordan. We know this.
No, I think they're creatively bankrupt, and they're flailing to try to figure out how to please everybody.
It's true, but they're wildly successful as well. So.
For now, we'll see. Yeah. Their stock just took a nosedive, so we'll see how this goes.
About that off pod.
Yeah, they are in not good shape. But anyway, you could say that the default setting for 5th edition is the Forgotten Realms. Vaguely. I'd argue not, because they're really just scooping history and just trying to smash as much, like Clayton was saying, it's a kitchen sink approach. They've completely looted Greyhawk of adventures for reprints, and now they're trying to do it to Dragonlance. But as far as do these settings have a history, you're right about Tolkien. I'm going to talk about Greyhawk because that was the first Dungeons & Dragons TSR official setting, and that's the one that I know the best right now. They did have a Stone Age, and it's very much inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, where you've got all of these really weird kind of monsters, the aboleths, the Kapru, there's a ton of them. All the kind of squid-like, like weird creatures.
Favorites.
Yeah, these ancient empires. A lot of them were like underwater empires, but they pretty much just had all of the regular humanoid races as their slaves for eons. And
I'm loving it.
There's a few different stories about how it goes, and there's no books that I know of that like really deep dive into this stuff. It's just a lot of like, implied history, but somehow or another, the humans kind of break out, and somewhere in there, the elves kind of show up. Elves were not enslaved in this way. I think they were just kind of off in wherever it is that they're at, whatever plane they originated from, with Corellon. And then kind of like Star Trek with the Vulcans helping humans into the Federation, that's sort of how humans kind of civilize. And there's in certain places in Greyhawk on the random encounter tables, this is why a couple episodes ago I was talking about how much I love random encounter tables telling you something about the world. You can roll a random encounter with cavemen. They're still just fucking like Neanderthals hanging out in caves that have just never civilized in D&D.
Oh, and don't get me started on other hominids. That's also something I've been thinking a lot about.
Yeah, but anyway, that's where human magic comes from. They kind of like learn it from the elves mostly, and then the thing that I think keeps magic from taking over is that people have some idea of history. You've got the twin cataclysms where the mage empires came head to head and had their nuclear Armageddon and set the whole world back millennia. Then you also have this kind of shows up in second edition a little more. There's this constant fear of liches, Vecna being the prototype of this. Everybody's afraid that some lich is going to rise and just take over shit, and liches don't even have to win people to their side. They can just overflow your borders with zombies and skeletons, and you're just kind of fucked because they don't have to make morale rolls. So yeah, I think those factors of people just being very suspicious of magic generally, and also that back in the day it was difficult to do. You had to have a lot of talent. You had to have a high end to be a spellcaster, to even have a chance at it. Then you also had to spend a shitload of time. On the character creation tables, you rolled for your age. And depending on your class, you would have to add more to whatever your starting age was. So wizards were the oldest to start with player characters every time because you spent however many years or decades learning. And it wasn't as easy as, well, I'll spend a week downtime and come back with a wizard level. No. You have to go to the Tower of High Sorcery and pass the fucking test and yada yada. You might die along the way. So yeah.
I mean, a limiting factor in and of itself, if you're looking at D&D Wizards, is just the written word. I mean, there has to be spells to get. We're learning this definitely in your game that, wizards have a spell book that they have scribed a spell into. Well, it doesn't matter how much experience points you got. If you can't find any more spells, you're never going to cast any more spells. So a limiting factor that is also kind of obvious is that, if there could just be very few spells available, and the access to those spells could be heavily regulated, or it would take a lifetime to accumulate a powerful set of spells, and maybe those people do manage to be super powerful, but, like you were saying, by that time they're old unless they can lich themselves. Then, but
why would one wizard give another wizard a spell?
Right. Well, I mean, and plus another thought I'd had as a limiting factor is taking seriously your components, right? As you get higher up in level, the components do get more expensive and more rare, and so that can be it could be a limiting factor for a wizard who blows their wad trying to take over this kingdom, and but they happen to fall a little bit short, it's like, I guess I'm casting my first level spells because that's all I have left. Mm-hmm. I'm about to die. So that's a limiting factor, I think, that could avoid a mageocracy.
I think, this is more in favor of a mageocracy, but like Jordan, your question of why would a wizard give another character their spells, that hoarding of knowledge, it could result in a mageocracy if like some sort of an academy style evolved. But if it is just one lone hermit or one lone person in town who is very jealous of or very guarded with their magic that they have, there really isn't a motivation to share that to everyone, even if any random person could potentially the type of person who could develop that. Like if we're using wizards as the example here, there's a limitation, or in previous editions there was a limitation on intelligence based on the wizard being able to cast. And so a wizard, if they felt the need to share their knowledge in some way, maybe they were getting toward the end of their life and they didn't want all of their hard work to go to waste. They wanted, and lichdom wasn't a viable route of immortality. Another route of immortality is just your legacy. And you could have families develop in that way, dynastic families, or you could have that wizard decide, okay, it's getting time that I don't want my contributions to magic. The spells that I have developed and put my name on, I want those to perpetuate because that's the only way I'm going to live on. And so you have an incentive to select for not only the intelligence, but you're kind of also would be selecting on the personality of the type of person who would succeed you. And that would be one mechanism by which wizards don't become just this overpowering force in the world, because no one wizard wants any of their rivals to become the person who has access to all of their spells and uses that to conquer other places. I can see both sides of an academy system being constructed and that limiting or that constraining, creating an elite class. I can also see the logic for why it would remain more of a hermetic style of magic where, like the Sith, there is the master and then there is the apprentice, and that is the way things are always.
And another thing I thought of listening to you talk, something that you kind of touched on there too is, wizards are very smart. They don't necessarily have very high wisdom, but, the typical wizard, you figure you're old. Why are you a wizard? What motivation does a wizard have to even want to be the ruler of a kingdom? That's something else that needs to be in the mix too. Not necessarily every person wants to be a politician, and business people who are clearly very intelligent and capable, they don't just necessarily go into politics to take over the world.
Apparently the very dumb ones do.
Yeah, the dumbest ones do. But yeah, so it could be that just the path that one has to walk to become a wizard, you live a life that doesn't necessarily make being a settled ruler of a kingdom something that would even interest you in the first place.
You just don't have the time. So much of a wizard's downtime is going to be spent in research and gathering components and, practicing the spells that they have and figuring out, going through all the old lore where the ancient scrolls from such and such civilization might be buried. Who's got time to do all the fucking bullshit, the hobnobbing and the state dinners and all that fucking bullshit?
It would almost have to be to get it out of the way. I could imagine a world where these very dialed in focused groups of wizards keep getting checked. They're basically the kingdom itself, the political structure is a bother to their pursuits, and that becomes so frustrating that they gather up at accounts, be like, man, this freaking king, he keeps he won't let us go in there, something about his dead ancestors, but okay, so can we just go take care of this guy? And setting up the magocracy is almost just to be controlling of it, get it out of the way, and so they can just get past to their regular pursuits.
Jordan, what you were saying was making me think back of the patron system for artists in the Middle Ages, and that is exactly how magic would develop, and that's why you have King Arthur and Merlin, his wizard who can do all sorts of magical stuff, but just care to rule the kingdom because he's got his own thing, and the petty concerns of the kingdom aren't really something that he's concerned about when he is unraveling the mysteries.
Yeah, and he's just like Gandalf too, right? At that point he's serving a higher power in it, you know what I mean? Gandalf would never take over the world because I mean, he's literally there doing God's will and will leave whenever it's done. That's a very different type of wizard than just your random Forgotten Realms. That's that kingdom of Thay? Is it Thay? Yeah, that's a different kind of thing.
Even the evil wizards, when you just look at what the scope of power is available to really high level wizards and what that person's life could be if they get up into plane shift and stuff like that. Who gives a shit about pushing around some peasants in this random dirt ball in the cosmos when you could just go to the elemental plane of air and fly around infinitely for fun, or go to Arborea or wherever, any number of planes in the multiverse, and do whatever the fuck you want there. It's just so pedestrian to think about, I'm going to be the king of the domain and blah 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 blah.
That's true.
I think there's also something to be said for the mindset of an adventurer, and that absolutely not being the mindset of anyone else in the world, including these other high-level wizards, because these other high-level wizards that we're talking about in the world, they're not going out adventuring. When was there a story about all of the adventures that Vecna went on in order to accumulate all his power? He became a lich, and he basically had other people go out and do all the shit for trying to conquer the world for him.
Mordenkainen does some adventuring, but that's largely just harkening back to adventures that Gary Gygax ran with that character. In the lore, though, you're right, he's definitely a quest giver, and that goes with all of the others. That's an interesting thing that I guess we could bring up. In Greyhawk, there's this thing called the Circle of Eight. It's pretty much all the named wizards that you can think of, mostly from name spells. It's Mordenkainen, it's Bigby, Tensor, all these guys, and they're pretty much the Avengers for balance in Greyhawk, and they have agents all over the place, but they don't directly control anything. They've got their citadels, and every now and then they come together when something major is threatening the world. But yeah, they try not to favor any one particular country or anything, but they make sure that if things get just way too crazy, Ayus is an example of super powerful chaos concentrated on the planet. That's the kind of thing they'll try to rein in and make sure it doesn't go out of control. But yeah, even when you've got abyssal chaos like that's essentially just nihilism personified, even the lawful good gods and whoever will all kind of throw their weight behind the forces of balance, because the alternative is complete obliteration. So I think that is it. All of that is, and lawful evil as well to some extent. I think that's what keeps things from going really crazy, and you having some world-ending Galactus level arch wizard come along and be like, all right, this place is mine now. Nah, you're gonna get sniped way before that, and spies are gonna find out you're up to it years in advance.
How much would it suck if you happen to live in a kingdom that just naturally didn't have a whole lot of native magically inclined people? Thinking in terms of druid magic and sorcerers in 3rd edition. I always thought of those of almost being genetic quirks. It's oh, hey, this guy the redheaded guy, he's he can do magic. Just your neighbors, they have a lot of wizards and sorcerers or whatever, but we just don't have that many, and they kind of beat up on us and come steal our shit all the time. And we throw bow and arrows, they turn our arrows into snakes, and we cry. Yeah,
this kingdom is all xenophobic. They didn't have sex with all the cool magical creatures, so they don't have sorcerers.
They just rode their unicorns. What did we talk enough about? I mean, we kind of just poo-pooed the idea of theocracies off on, competing gods would keep the balance in check. But I mean, competition can be very, fractious. There's a lot of friction in that kind of world that I could think of.
I think it really depends on the specific world, because Greyhawk has multiple pantheons, not just a bunch of gods. They have multiple pantheons, and the pantheons sometimes come up against each other and butt heads. heads. Eberron is the same way. It has specific pantheons for different areas, and I'm just much more familiar with Eberron than I am with Greyhawk. And Greyhawk or Eberron has a theocracy, Thane, and it is its own pantheon. Also, they worship this silver flame, I think is what it's called. So their entire religion is separate from all of the other Eberron religions, and they have a country that they rule. I think whenever you look at other worlds like Forgotten Realms, where all of the gods are there are literally hundreds of gods in Forgotten Realms, but they're all the Forgotten Realms deity. They're not representing different pantheons in different areas. There aren't two gods who are the god of light and of the sun, like Greyhawk has.
Yeah.
Can I pull this conversation back a little bit too? We're just having it's so great to see your all's faces and talk. This has been the most enjoyable kind of conversation we've had, but kind of keeping in mind a potential listener, I'm thinking in terms, maybe it should be said that this is like a very nerdy example of why it's so difficult to run a game from a world you've created. Mm-hmm. Because if you fall too much in love with your world building, you can solve these problems, you can answer these problems, and then come up with more problems and contradiction, till it paralyzes you. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, the world building, not everything doesn't have to make sense. And part of Jordan's game has taught me a lot in the last year on this very topic. And it's very important to remember when you're running a game and creating your own content from scratch, that the game is a limiting factor. And if you get too far ahead of your skids when it comes to your work, you try to tell a story, I've created these, you start wanting to show off all your shiny little objects, you'll have a really great world background, but you're going to have a really terrible dungeon because you just let that be the side thing. Because it's so easy to tangent on your world that you have to remember that your players are walking into a game to be entertained. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter what the gods say if those gods don't affect your players. The game itself has to be. So you don't always have to solve these problems. These are just for the people, the crazy people like me who will world build on a world that he never intends to even run in the first place.
I think it's worth thinking about it for nothing else than just idea fodder. Mm-hmm. You'll come up with all kinds of interesting takes, and maybe there's multiple answers to any one of these weird kind of questions, and that's where your diversity of nations will come from. Different people have struck different balances between the arcane and the divine and the mundane. One of the things I'd struggle with a lot running that Greyhawk game is like when you've got gods that personify alignments, you quickly get into theocratic kind of problems, classic philosophy problems. If you've got Pelor and Haronius and St. Cuthbert, these objectively good gods who can grant to their clerics the ability to cure wounds, to cure diseases, to feed people out of thin air, why is there suffering in the world? You immediately get to that problem of evil. And so in kicking this around, I thought up, well, maybe for every cure wounds that gets granted, a cause wounds happens on the other side, and that's the cosmic balance. That every disease that Pelor cures, Nerul gets to cause a disease somewhere else. And thus the cosmos does not collapse.
Or maybe Pelor is a god on multiple dimensions, and in our world he's a good god because he grants all this healing, but in another world he's the Nerul because he has to inflict it on someone in the other world. So the drive to be evil is more out of a way to fuel being good in the other world. It'd be kind of neat. But those ideas can fill your head all day long. I caution people to forget that the dungeons have to be sick.
Yeah.
In the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game, there's a mechanic where there are a certain number of force points that are available. Some of them are dark and some of them are light. And as light side force powers get used, it gets flipped over. So they're like Othello pieces where a dark side if a light side force piece gets used, then it flips over to dark, and now dark has more power. And I see like Jordan, in your world, it's this type of story that seems to be going on now is that whenever when the characters who were alive at the beginning of the campaign, when we were playing, the light side was flipping over a whole bunch of these little tokens, and we got jettisoned forward into the future, and in the intervening years, the dark side decided to start flipping over points, and so that's the cosmic balance. That's for every cure there is a cause wounds, or every cure wounds there is a cause wounds. I kind of see that kind of the cosmic balance that is being played out, where maybe the good aligned gods do have a tremendous amount of power, but that tremendous amount of power is balanced by the amount of power that the darkness has, and using more light powers gives the dark more power to use in the future. And the goal is to keep the whole thing in. Yeah. I really like that concept.
Does Hieronius send a Planetar to go clean up on the battlefield, knowing that a Baylor is the cost? Yeah. Walking around like, maybe not.
I have a lot of thoughts in there. Again, speaking to the masochistic, listener, one solution that I'd had the one solution that you have for these things is obviously you don't always have to play D&D. There are other systems that if you are a hardcore world builder and just want even the world itself to be completely a reflection of your creativity, not have to reckon with these spells or whatever. There are lots of great systems out there. I was looking at Mithras / the basic role-playing system. It gives you a lot of creative control. Hero system is a set of materials, games that give you a lot of world-building creativity too. But, you got to remember the advantage of D&D, the appeal of D&D is you get to play within the world. You get to start. You accept the contradictions. You accept some of these things because you can get started playing in 30 minutes, right? You don't have to start with, on the seventh day, God created, God rested, and then build everything forward. That for a world builder, that's maybe that's a separate hobby.
When you're world building a game in which other players are going to be the heroes, there comes a point where you have to stop world building and stop thinking through all of the things that you have set in motion and allow the player characters. It's now their time to figure out the solutions to all this problem. I don't know if I was going anywhere else other than just saying that.
Is there any other topics that Jordan have been jumping in your head?
You were talking about other games. I've been reading Dungeon Crawl Classics lately, and it's popular OSR quote-unquote games. It has a pretty interesting conceivable solution, I think, to the magocracy question, and that's that when magic fucks up, it deforms the caster in some way. And over time, you start turning into this Emperor Palpatine kind of creature as you go. But that brings up one of the issues about D&D, and that is the reliability of the magic. If it's one of my biggest complaints about D&D is that the magic is just too certain when you cast it. I've resisted the urge so far of forcing you guys to make casting rolls in our D&D game. I will continue to resist it for now, but every instinct in me tells me no, it'd be much more interesting if magic was this wild thing that sometimes you can manage to wrangle, sometimes it just gets away from you and weird shit happens. That's what happens in that is bizarre magical errors occur, and
that's true. If you get too stuck in a particular mindset, you can forget the fact that completely so obvious, but I didn't think about that. Why doesn't bad things happen when you fail?
Mage of the Awakening dealt really heavily. There was called paradox that built up as you cast spells, and the bigger and more obvious the spell, the more paradox built up, and when enough paradox existed, something catastrophically bad happened.
I really love that idea. It was so formative in my early conceptions of role-playing games, the mage games. I love the idea that there is this extremely strong inertia behind consensus reality, and to be the asshole that's like, no, I want the world to be this way, and risk trying to push all of that in one direction. Maybe you push things that tiny little bit, or maybe it just slams back and crushes you in the fabric of the universe somehow. That's exciting. That's bold.
It's worthy of the mage being the main character in the. You know what I mean? That I would expect. I've never actually read or played Mage. I need to get that book because you would expect there to be a lot more nuance and thoughtfulness about magic in a game that centers itself around. Not that D&D doesn't, but it's only one of how many classes. Everybody's got to have room in D&D. There's got to be room for the fighter to have his glory too.
Well, I mean, in 5th edition, pretty much every class, counting subclasses that are available, archetypes and all that, every class can become a magic caster one way or another. Yeah. And it's really not all that hard.
I think that's so. I think they've really cannibalized their own under in that way.
Another thing that original D&D, a good idea that OD&D did that had part of to satisfy player problems they've cut back on that I think dealt with this issue pretty well. Is just that not every player or not every class advances at the same rate with XP, and because it was famous in 3rd. I don't know if you've. I remember it being this way in 3rd edition that just everybody knew that the wizard at high levels is just going to take over the game and take over the show. Mm-hmm. It's still, I think it's still that way in 5th. Once you get to high levels, everybody looks forward to the magic, the big magical effect more than just the fighter swinging that damn sword again and again. But so to me it makes sense that a wizard should have a staggered experience to give the other players the room to be awesome and let the wizard trail behind. Because if not, that's why I always play wizards. Honestly, I like variety. I don't like swinging my sword every damn time. I like picking and choosing different things.
And even in older editions, that experience discrepancy wasn't the only factor causing a wizard to think about very hard whether or not he wanted to continue being a wizard. Just that it took longer to do. There were a lot of spells like, haste that rapidly aged you. Wish, I don't remember what the cost was, but it was pretty severe. I want to say it
5 years, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty something like that. And even in 3rd edition, crafting magic items cost experience points. By this is written. Everybody ignored that, but that's another topic.
So this was in 5th?
In 3rd edition.
In 5th, nothing matters. You don't actually earn anything. And I think that system where the wizards level up slower from earlier editions was genius, because it's a meta simulation of what the wizard's life is like as you're playing this thing you're building up and spending all this time and thinking about the long game and putting up with the short-term weakness and slights and all that, and you're building up this huge accumulation of power. You're doing exactly what your character is doing in-game with your character mechanically as you play every session. That's a stroke of genius. But when everybody's kind of doing the same thing, moving at the same pace, and at every level you're guaranteed your next tier of powers, whatever they might be skinned as, that's lost. It's completely gone. I think that's a shame.
Yeah, because I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that really even though we're talking about grand politics, what we're really sparking here is the fact that even a party in typical Dungeons and Dragons reflects this balance, because, as written, I think most of us agree that at least the priest, the cleric, and the wizard, but really any of the magic-wielding classes, but specifically the wizard and the cleric, it's really their world, and we're living in it once you get far enough down the road in the game. I mean, it doesn't always have to be that way. It obviously depends on the player, but when it comes to just raw ability and magical things they can do, you get to 10th level at wizard, especially if you fill in the rules that they don't ever put in, like how do you make magic items, how do you make potions. If you as a dungeon master give a pathway to give your magical players the ability to embed them in enchantments and things, at that point it's a wash. I mean, it's always the wizard's world. Mm-hmm.
While we're talking about magic mechanics that have fallen by the wayside over the years, I have to talk about the druid advancement as being definitely the most severely limiting advancement I have ever seen in a role-playing game. I don't remember at what level this starts happening. It's not too long into your gaming or into your character's career before there's only so many slots that are available for a particular level of druid. And I don't remember at what level. There is only ever one druid of like maybe 10th or 11th in first edition. There's only ever one in the world. And the only way you can become that one is either that one retires or you kill him.
Or you get Highlander on it, baby.
Yeah.
Love it. I love that idea.
It's the same thing for monks too. As they go up in their orders, tiered. Yeah, there's fewer and fewer of them. You have to defeat the one prior. Got you right, Clayton. I believe that that starts around 12th level or so. Druid, and then 13th level is Arch Druid, and 14th is just the Great Druid, and that's the last Druid.
Yep, and even before that, within a particular region, there are only so many of the intermediary steps, like I want to say somewhere between 5 and 10. Like, that's regional based, and there's only so many druids of a particular level within a given region.
Since we're getting kind of far along, this was a thought that, bringing it all back, I'm realizing we've talked a lot about things I hear on. I listen to a lot of different podcasts, so this conversation could exist on a writing podcast. This conversation could be a big scale game designer conversation. You could see people at Wizards having, or other companies. But for the small scale DM, I feel like why these kind of considerations matter isn't so much that people like me, I want to go solve all these problems because I just find that fun, and I don't even have to have any other reason. That's just all I need it for. But if you're a GM just trying to kind of, I guess in a way, level up your game, make your game even more fun for your players, once you get beyond the dungeon, say you have a dungeon you want to run and you're setting it in your world, or maybe you've created your dungeon. Dungeons are really black and white. I think about the Donjon generator that you could go out anytime you want and it'll just randomly make you one. But you have to give your players whys. Why are they going into this dungeon? Why is it worth it? And that's good. There is going to be that story element that you have to wrap your game and wrap the experience of play around. And when you're creating a world, thinking about these contradictions will help you make your world. Say you don't even have the whole world built. You just, you're going to take them to a small town, and then that small town's going to give them a reason to go into this dungeon. Well, when you're peopling this small town, most people just spring up a Tudor-style medieval, not even like an old-school medieval. It's usually like a Elizabethan Tudor-style village that you go to, and the culture is essentially, England in the late Middle Ages or High Middle Ages, and that's just a default culture. But if you just give a little bit of thought about your world and your gods, it's really about giving the illusion of depth, in writing. It's fun as a DM and as a player to be pulled into a game, be pulled into a dungeon or an adventure by the illusion of depth, because you could find that maybe this wizard has been, or I'm not even going to go into examples. The listener can figure that out, but I think you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think the DM in a lot of ways kind of sets the standard for how seriously you take the game, and you can't expect your players to take the game any more seriously than the DM does. And so, by take it seriously, I don't mean getting bent out of shape about it. I mean giving some time and attention and putting some polish into it so that it asks less of your suspension of disbelief. You can just really feel like you're there a little bit more than you would if there's just glaring inconsistency, clear oversights that were just a product of laziness or whatever.
And I'll say, maybe one of my last thoughts really is that's going to pull your players in. Mm-hmm. I had a conversation recently with a buddy we all played in a game I ran years ago. And when I ended that game, I was trying to transition into completely self-created content. And that didn't work for me in that moment. But looking back on it, though, he latched on. He asked me about it, and he was like, "Hey, what about that Heaven Glass stuff? I was really into. What was the deal with that?" Without me even thinking about it, because in the DM you've got so many things in your head. Your players will want to come sit back at your table if they find a novel idea that you've just kind of jammed in there. Maybe you haven't even solved it on the other end. You've just put a little flavor in it. You add some flavor by putting your own uniqueness that separates the world from the real world. there's going to be a player on your table who's going to want to follow that storyline in and of itself, because that's just curious to them. And the more alien aspects you sprinkle into your world, so it's not just a clone of feudal whatever, the more you're going to interest your players and want to get them back in the seat.
And if you're world building and you come up with a solution for every little idea you throw out, like the Heaven Glass, you're not going to know what the players are going to latch onto. So you're going to be spending all of this energy filling everything out when you don't know what's the stuff that's going to be relevant. And you're also not going to be allowing for the creativity of the players and meant to give you inspiration for what something was like.
True.
So whenever I world build, I try to stop when there's enough problems in the world left that the players need the ones to start providing them rather than.
So true.
Are we ready to move on to geek things?
Yeah.
Well, then I will go first. I have recently found a video on, or rather a YouTuber, Dr. Jeff Lindy. He's a linguistics professor, and he does a great breakdown of the differences in how native English speakers pronounce all sorts of different words in their accents. So if you are interested in accents half as much as I am, it's a great resource to really, he goes into depth not only how words are supposed to be spoken, but also how in reality they are actually spoken. Like the fact that whenever I said spoken, I didn't actually say the SP, I kind of did an SB sound for spoken. If you listen to it, the way
this is my jam.
He takes video clips of like people in interviews, like famous people, and giving concrete examples of how the way that we are taught to speak English is not the way that anybody actually.
100%. Spoken from someone who teaches children to read. It's maddening once you dive into the weeds, because we think there's rules in this game. There ain't no rules in the English language. That's a lie. I love that stuff. I want to shout out a book Jordan tossed at me that I bought off Drive-Thru RPG that dealt with dealt with our topic a little bit. It's called The Magical Industrial Revolution by a fellow or a lady named Skirples. I'm assuming that's a sentence. I don't know. I'm assuming that's not their real name, but whatever. A pre-apocalyptic setting guide, which I thought was really cool. I bought it. I think they create content out of www.coinsandscrolls.blogspot.com, and it's just a very high magical city that they recommend, that they've given you, they've made, that they run their games in, that you can plop into your world if you just want there to be this out of control magical metropolis that is on the verge of collapse, but is actually at the moment in its heyday, and just to have that in your world. And it's cool. Like, they put a lot of work into it. It looks really neat. I've enjoyed reading it. Give it a look. It's awesome. Worth the $15.
Let's see. I might have shouted this out before, but I'm going to go ahead and do it again because I've really been enjoying it lately. There's a podcast called Bandits Keep. This guy named Daniel does it. He also has the same thing on a YouTube channel. It's really great old school D&D content. He actually runs games, I guess, using a customized version of chainmail rules for individual characters, and takes little bits and pieces where he needs from early D, but tries to keep it as old school as possible. It sounds like, and very fast paced, like Conan-esque kind of sword and sorcery stuff, but. His podcast is great, really thoughtful, has a lot of interesting topics. I don't miss an episode, so if listeners enjoy this podcast, they'll probably enjoy that one. Bandits Keep.
Can I throw something else at your topic, since it occurred to me that you said podcast? If you watch Clayton's suggestion and you enjoy it, you should give a listen to the History of English podcast too by Kevin Stroud. I know I've recommended it before. I've probably 4 or 5 times. It's awesome. You should go check it out. If you geek out on that, you will geek out on that podcast for sure.
All right, guys. What do you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Let's do it.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.